welcome to another video. This is a how-to video regarding a 1998 to 2001 Lexus GS300, IS300, anything effectively that's equipped with a 2JZ-GE non-turbo VVT-i motor. The earlier years have a specific wiring harness, but all of them basically will go through the same setup. This is regarding standalone piggyback setup using a Haltech Elite 750. So the Haltech effectively is running the engine with the exception of the drive-by-wire and the transmission control effectively. It has full control over the ignition, the injection, and things like rev limits, fail safes, the VVT, the spark events in terms of the logic on the knock control and things like that. And it can do closed loop fueling as well. So right now, in terms of a setup, you can see here we have Haltech ESP software pulled up. We have a live video feed from the engine as well as the dash cluster shown here. And then we also, if we go to a still image of the engine, we're using a Boomslang plug-and-play harness that effectively just bridges the Haltech ECU into the vehicle harness of the Lexus GS300 here. This is a 1998 model year. And for power adder boosted engines, GTE variant, there's not very much different in terms of the configuration of sensors and whatnot. That gives you a relative idea. The only extra thing is obviously this vehicle is equipped with a MAF sensor and using the volumetric efficiency model for all of the Haltech Elite software for the fuel model. That's the MAF sensor is not being used to do fuel calculations, so we have the MAP signal plumbed into here to my location on the intake manifold. So we'll go ahead and connect to the ECU. So we have the ignition on. We will cycle it here so you get an idea of what's going to happen. We'll go over to the Haltech ESP software and we will click connect here. Do we want to save changes? No. So we'll connect to the ECU, and once that happens, it's going to read the map from the ECU. The base map to get this file started on, or get the vehicle started for any GE motor, so 2JZ-GE, is available on our website. Link in the description below, as well as the card shown here. So you can see here the live readings from the ECU. So obviously the engine's stalled, it's off, so 0 RPM. This is the reading from the map sensor in kilopascals. This is the TPS here, so you can see we can go through a TPS recalibration. We're getting to 96% when we're full and 0. However, this particular vehicle does have different driving modes in terms of the drive-by-wire mapping. So the actual throttle position is something different from what the TPS is, or the pedal position. Coolant temperature sensor, intake air temp, injection time, ignition angle, and battery voltage. Right now we're hooked up to a battery tender. And then this is your main fuel table, volumetric efficiency with RPM on one axis and load on the other axis in terms of manifold pressure. So we'll go ahead and crank the engine. We can see it come here to idle, and we're seeing the live sensor readings here. So the engine does idle extremely well. The first thing you will notice, however, right here on the dash, obviously the seatbelt light is on because I don't have my seatbelt clicked on. The vehicle stability control system, there's a warning light, and then it's actually off. So because the Haltech now has full control over the engine and in terms of ignition, fueling, and VVT. The OEM computer that's still hooked up on this vehicle doesn't have the kind of authority to manipulate any of those things, and it's recognizing that, and it's saying those are the things that it's using, the control parameters that it's using to actually execute the traction control and the vehicle skid control when the vehicle gets out of control. So now it can no longer do that, so those two lights will remain on. The Haltech is actually controlling the check engine light right now. So if there's any diagnostic trouble codes that show up here, so we do have one that was previous previously on the ECU here. It was just because from hooking up to power on the bench. We can erase that, and now there's 0 DTCs, and we'll make sure that that stays like this throughout the run here. So you can see the live operating point. We're about 65 kilopascals and 750 RPM. I will rev the engine up a little bit, and you'll see that we're staying around the same load, around 1300-ish RPM here, and we can come back to idle. Right now, the ignition angle is 10 degrees. The injection time is around 3 milliseconds. Our target lambda is stoichiometric. Just until we build coolant temperature here, we can do some things with some rev limits and a two-step rev limit, and we can look at the ignition cut, a soft versus hard ignition cut, and the influence of the hysteresis RPM on that. So we can see just kind of the tree of all of the different menu items and the tables that are available in the ESP software for this particular base map here. So VVT is a special feature that this motor has. We'll bring up the target angle for the engine. Right now at idle we have 0 as the target. We can advance and retard that, so we'll start by retarding it here, or advancing, apologies. And you can see that the idle stability, first of all, the idle will lower slightly, but it will become slightly less stable now. If we actually go and bring up the VCT here, we'll see the target versus the actual. So we can see the table here as we're live adjusting it. So I'll continue to adjust that, and we'll see the cam angle here. So we haven't actually tuned the PID control on the VVT-i system yet, so it's a little bit laggy, especially because there's not a lot of oil pressure right now at idle. But we can continue to increase this, and the motor will actually become, the RPM will start to drop, and the motor will become a little bit more unstable. The idle air control is making up for this here in combination with the ignition timing and everything to try and steady the RPM, but there's only so much it can do. So we can actually get the idle to be kind of lopey if we continue to go here to something unreasonable. You would never want to run this intake cam angle, but just as an example, the motor is still running here. We'll go in the other direction, so we'll go back to 0. You'll notice the lag in terms of the target versus the actual cam angle. So you can see the response time there of the cam angle is a few seconds to go about 30 degrees with this oil pressure at this RPM. At higher RPM, when you're driving the engine, especially in this load range here, between kind of 2,000 and 4,500 at higher loads where the VVT is really active, right around here, the VVT responds much faster. So we'll continue to decrease the cam advance here, and we'll see what happens to the idle stability. So we're fairly reasonable here. We can't actually retard it. So despite us trying the target here, we're actually locked against the hard stop. So we can only advance the cam. So cam phasers that have advance and retard capability, obviously that would be something you could control in both directions, but we're just bottoming it out at 0. So that gives you an idea of what that can do. Let's see the effect of ignition timing. So we'll adjust the base ignition table here on the idle characteristics. So we will go to the idle tab, the base ignition timing table, and we can see our operating point, and we'll just start increasing the ignition timing and see what happens to the idle. So despite us increasing it, the base timing, because we're in the idle mode right now, there's actually no difference, that the actual ignition timing isn't changing. So this is something that the idle control, because we're in that state, has control over. So we'll go back to the original settings. We'll rev the engine up a little bit. You can see it's a little bit unstable because this is just a base map and it's not tuned. So we can actually induce some knock here if we continue. We can retard a little bit. We'll bring it back down. So we're about 3,000-ish RPM there. Gives you an idea of kind of the sensitivity to ignition timing on the idle, and then now we'll tune the volumetric efficiency map here. So we have lambda sensors hooked up. However, it's not operating in closed loop now. We've disabled kind of the closed loop functionality. So we can add fuel, and we can see that really the effective or fuel ratio, obviously if there was the ability to convey smell, we can probably smell more raw fuel right now if we were at the tailpipe, but in terms of the engine idle quality, there's really no difference. So we'll come back down and we'll bring these back down. And we can see that the idle is just pretty much rock stable at 670. So now that the motor has some heat in it, we can look at the RPM rev limiter. So just for sake of argument here, we will change these two to 2700 RPM. And we can see the RPM rev limit here. If we go to setup, or we click F4 for main setup, we can go to functions, and we can type in whatever function we want to kind of search for and manipulate here. So we will look at limit, anything with a limit in it. So RPM limiter. So right now we have it set it to an ignition hard cut, and we have a 30 RPM hysteresis. We'll start with a soft cut just to understand what it'll do, and we'll click apply, and then we can just make this a little smaller so we can make these changes while you still see kind of everything happening. So we'll go back to the main here, and we'll rev the engine, and we'll observe here on the tachometer the soft cut happening. So I'm just going to give it some light load so you can see the tach signal go away, and the engine RPM was effectively just holding at 7,500. If I give it more gas here, so I'll show the video from the actual exhaust pipe now. If I give it more gas, we can induce some more aggressive misfires. So now that's what a soft cut looks like. Let's change it to a hard cut. By default, the hysteresis is either 250 or 300 RPM. Let's start with 200 RPM and see the effect of that. And what that means, the hysteresis RPM here, if I just expand this a little bit, it means effectively the upper and lower bounds of where the RPM will cycle between. So we'll see now when I click apply, we can see what will happen when we enable a hard cut. And now we're only cutting ignition. We're not doing anything to the fueling. So we'll enable a hard cut. And you can see kind of a conventional type hard cut there. So we can make this smaller by a factor of 10, and it will be a much tighter upper and lower limit. So we'll change that hysteresis RPM to 20 now. You can see how it reacts there. So that gives you some idea to kind of how the motor will react to some of these different RPM limiters, and effectively any of the engine protection strategies that you're going to use in terms of oil pressure, fuel pressure, lean protection. You can enable one of these different cuts to limit the engine RPM to stop it from causing a catastrophic failure. Other than that, there's some other features that we'll go over once we're actually driving the vehicle, but now just idling. That kind of sums up some of the things that you might want to adjust. The transmission control is still handled exclusively through the stock control module. We're only controlling the engine with the Haltech here. So for that reason, generally you probably want to shift manually if you're raising the rev limiter. Only because the transmission control generally will fight for authority between what the engine wants to do and what the transmission control wants to do. So that still is something that is important to remember. So we'll set these back to where they were before, 7,000. And we can look at some other things. Let's say target lambda. So as I mentioned, we're not operating in closed loop mode, but you can see here for pretty much everything that we'll hit while we're idling, as we move this cell around, pretty much we're always at around 1. Now we've removed that soft cut, so rev the engine all the way out here. And the response with this map in terms of the acceleration enrichment and all the transient fueling is actually quite good. If we go back to the main table here, we can see the transient throttle being highlighted once we're at once this light becomes illuminated here. So you can see it's illuminated there, and it's adding all of the extra correction parameters for transient throttle, meaning that acceleration enrichment and all of the transient throttle adjustments to the ignition timing and the VVT and all of that. So now it's time to go for a drive and see how it behaves once we start moving.